The Last of Us Part 2 has already been enhanced for PS5 systems. In May of 2021, the PS4 version was updated with support for PS5 hardware, enabling PS5s to run the game at 1440p at 60 frames per second. This new remastered PS5 release seems to promise more, so what's up with the rendering here? The basic visual setup is very familiar, at least by default. We're getting a 1440p 60 experience in the default performance mode, just like the earlier patched code. There's no signs of DRS or upsampling here as far as I can tell. Side-by-sides suggest that the two versions are a match in terms of basic image quality, with a similar, slightly soft resolve. If you look closely, you can spot some aliasing here and there, but for the most part the two releases seem perfectly fine, especially when seen from a typical TV viewing distance. By far the largest settings difference between the two titles lies in their handling of foliage. The foliage in the original code has some very obvious pop-in and level of detail compromises, showing less dense foliage at a distance that doesn't animate. On the remastered version, we don't see nearly as much pop-in during traversal, and areas distant from the camera have better foliage coverage. This extends beyond the greenery. Notice how the railing draws in on the remastered version here, for instance, but it's most noticeable on foliage elements. The Last of Us Part 2 mostly takes place in grassy outdoor environments, so these level of detail enhancements actually make for a pretty big improvement in most areas. The PlayStation Store description of the game also highlights improved shadow quality and texture quality, which are pretty tough to spot. Shadow aliasing and flicker from the PS4 release is replicated about the same here, and the presentation of shadows appears nearly identical between the two versions. This hanging container does exhibit a noticeably higher resolution shadow map on PS5, but I couldn't spot significant differences elsewhere in the game. General shadow quality appears to be largely identical to that original title, with very sparing exceptions. I captured dozens of up-close shots to get an idea of any texture resolution improvements, but I struggled to spot any differences in texture quality between the PS4 and PS5 code. The artwork was an exact match across every shot I tested, except for this shot where the dirt texture appears somewhat higher resolution in the remastered version. Like with the shadows, I wouldn't expect a wholesale improvement here, but perhaps tweaked assets show up very occasionally. Texture filtering, though, does receive a noticeable upgrade. See how distant ground detail resolves with less blur on the remastered code. Beyond those differences, I was able to spot some tweaks that seem to show up on a scene-by-scene basis. The lamp in this early cutscene, for instance, is a lot brighter in the PS5 code, which I think looks more realistic here. In the bar scene here, the patrons are properly shadowed, with what looks like capsule shadows along their feet. In a couple of gameplay scenes, I noticed that the slight depth of field effect at a distance was absent in the new version as well. Perhaps the most obvious difference is this shot in the opening cutscene, where the Ellie model appears quite different. Notice the de-emphasized eyes and different highlights on the eyes and skin, and the shot overall has been reframed. But in other flashback sequences, Ellie looks identical across the two versions. Overall, these two releases of The Last of Us Part 2 look fairly similar. Naughty Dog has definitely tweaked and touched up some aspects of the game's visual presentation here and there, but players shouldn't go in expecting a broad visual uplift relative to the patched PS4 code that we've had for the past 2.5 years. The biggest upgrade here over playing the game on a PS4 or PS4 Pro system is still the ability to play at 60 frames per second, which the remastered version and the patched version of the original both offer on PS5 systems. But there's one other visual mode here, the Fidelity mode, which should offer extra visual enhancements over the performance mode we've been looking at so far. Settings-wise, the key divide here comes down to output resolution. Fidelity mode targets a full 4K, a substantial upgrade from the 1440p resolve in performance mode, though the framerate target drops to 30 FPS when at 60Hz output. In actual head-to-heads though, I think it's not as big of an upgrade as you might expect. Both modes resolve an image that's largely free of aliasing in typical play, with higher internal pixel counts than we're used to from many current-gen titles. And from typical viewing distances, the difference between a straight 1440p and 4K isn't too profound. The 4K resolve does come with a certain clarity that the performance mode lacks, however, handing in a sharper rendition of fine details, like the blades of grass in this scene. Beyond the resolution differences, the ambient occlusion sometimes takes on a noticeably different appearance in the Fidelity mode. If you look at grass and foliage elements, these appear to have less obvious AO coverage against the ground. I don't think either is necessarily preferable over the other here though. I didn't spot any noticeable tweaks in LOD settings, volumetrics resolution, shadow resolution, texture filtering, or any other common tweakable. The two modes are essentially clones of each other, absent a slightly different foliage presentation and a bit of a delta in image quality. This is roughly what we observed in the other current-gen Naughty Dog titles as well, so there's no great surprise here.